This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are here in the reading room. Thanks for joining me on day 131 of the classroom. And we are here on our very last chapter. It is always a little emotional for me to end a book. It is. I was thinking about a time that my mom and I shared a book. We used to share books occasionally, but the weirdest book she shared with me. Thanks, Mom. Chapter 23. A parting, but not forever. Little Peter, he was a little bit of a stink, wasn't he? Peter has to learn that there are always people watching you and that the rewards or punishment of your behavior come from within yourself, no matter. The day before she was to start, the grandmama had sent off a letter to the elm so that her arrival would not take them by surprise. Peter brought this letter as he came up toward the pasture. The elm uncle had already come out before the hut with the children and stood ready with Schwanley and Barley by his side. The goats shook their pretty heads in the fresh morning breeze while the children patted them and wished them a happy journey to the pasture. The uncle looked with satisfaction first at the fresh faces of the children and then at his clean, well-bred goats. His face wore a very happy expression. At this moment, Peter made his appearance. When he saw the little group, he drew near very slowly and held the letter out to the uncle. The moment it had left his hand, he sprang back timidly and looked quickly behind him, as if something might be coming up which he was afraid. Then with one leap, he was off and up to the mountain. "Grandfather," said Heidi, who was much surprised at this queer conduct on the part of the goat herd, "why does Peter behave exactly like Big Turk when he sees a rod behind him?" "Perhaps Peter sees a rod behind him that he deserves," replied the grandfather. The lad ran up the nearest slopes at one pull. As soon as he was out of sight of the hut, it was different. Then he stopped and turned his head in a scared fashion in every direction. Suddenly he gave a jump and looked behind him, as frightened as if someone had seized him by the nape of his neck. From behind every bush, out of every thicket, he thought the police from Frankfurt might be ready to spring upon him. The longer this anxious dread lasted, the more unhappy Peter was, and he had at last not one quiet moment. Heidi soon went into the hut to put everything in order, for she wished the grandmama to find it looking very neat when she came. Clara found so much amusement in watching these proceedings on the part of Heidi that she always came to look on while her friend worked. They were both so well employed that the early morning hours slipped away, and it was almost time for the visitor to arrive before they knew how late it was. Then they came out and seated themselves to await the great event. The grandfather joined them. He had taken a walk that morning and brought home a big bunch of dark blue gentians, which looked so beautiful in the bright sunlight that the children exclaimed at the sight. He carried them into the hut. Every now and then Heidi sprang up from the bench and hoped to descry some sign of Grandmama's procession. There it was at last, just as Heidi had expected it would be. First came the guide, then the Grandmama on her white horse, then the porter with his basket piled with wraps, for the lady never would go up the mountain without plenty of means of keeping dry and warm. They came nearer and nearer. Now they had reached the summit, and the grandmama from her horse caught sight of the children. "What do I see? Clara, my child, what is this? You are not sitting in your chair!" The grandmama cried, quite startled, and hastened to dismount. But even before she reached the child, she clasped her hands together and said, "Is it you, Clara, or is it not? Your cheeks are red and round as apples. Child, I should not know you." The good lady darted toward her grandchild, but in a trice Heidi had slipped from the bench. Clara had risen quickly, supporting herself on her little friend's shoulder, and the two girls were calmly taking a little walk. The grandmama stood perfectly still at first from fright. She thought that Heidi was undertaking some unheard of thing. But what was it that she saw, upright and steady? Clara was walking by Heidi's side. The children came back after a few minutes, both with rosy cheeks, both with beaming faces. Now the grandmamma threw herself upon them, laughing and crying at once. She clasped Clara in her arms, then Heidi, and then again embraced her granddaughter, finding no words to express her joy. Presently, she spied the uncle, who was standing by the bench looking at the group with a contented smile. The grandmamma took Clara by the arm, and with increasing surprise and delight that it was indeed so, that the child was indeed walking by her side, moved with her towards the bench. Then she stopped and seized the uncle by both hands. My dear good uncle, how can we ever thank you? This is your work. It is your care and nursing. And our good Lord sunshine and mountain air, added the uncle, smiling. Yes, and Xuan Li's good sweet milk too, added Clara. You must see how I drink the goat's milk, Grandmama, and how good it is. I can see that by your cheeks, Clara. No, I really do not know you. You have grown round and plump as I never dreamed you could be. Is it really my Clara, who will not lose one moment, but telegraph to my son in Paris? He must come to see you immediately. I will not tell him why. It will be the greatest happiness of his whole life. How shall we arrange this, my dear uncle? You have sent the men down again, I suppose. Yes, they have gone, but if you are in such haste, we can send the goatherd down. He will have time enough. The grandmamma wished to send a dispatch at once to her son. He ought not to be deprived of his happiness a single hour. So the uncle went a little to one side and gave such a searching whistle through his fingers that the echo came back from the rocks far above them. Before long, Peter came running down. He was as white as chalk, for he thought that the uncle was whistling him down to be punished. Only a bit of paper was given to him, however, which the grandmamma had in the meantime written, and he received the order to take the paper to the post office in Dorfli. The uncle said he would attend to the payment later, for it was not safe to give Peter too much to do at once. Thus Peter set out quite relieved, his paper in his hand, for the uncle had not whistled him to his deserts, and no policeman to his deserts. And no policeman was to be seen. The party now seated themselves comfortably at the table, and everything that had passed was rehearsed to the grandmamma from the beginning. It took a long time to finish the story, for they were constantly interrupted by questions and expressions of thankful surprise. And my weak, pale, lame little grandchild is transformed into this blooming, round-faced maiden. It is a fairy tale, I do believe, cried Grandmamma, and delighted the children by showing how completely their plan of surprise had succeeded. Mr. Sussman, in his turn, had planned a surprise. He had set out one fine sunny morning from Paris and traveled on to Basel without stopping, and again the following day as quickly as possible. He had been seized with an irresistible desire to see his daughter, from whom he had been separated all summer. He had arrived in Ragatz just as his mother had left for the Elm. He had followed in a carriage to Mayenfeld and on to Dorfli, for he thought the walk up the Elm would be enough for him to undertake. He was quite right. Moreover, the steep climb was very fatiguing to him. He saw no cottage anywhere, and he knew too that halfway up he should have found the dwelling of Goat Peter, for he had heard the description of the mountain path often enough. There were little footpaths visible everywhere, crossing and recrossing each other. Mr. Sussman began to be afraid that he was mistaken and that the mountain cottage lay on another part of the Alp. He looked about, hoping to see some human being. It was perfectly quiet. Nowhere a sound to be heard, not a living creature to be seen. Only a mountain breeze fanned the air, while insects hummed and a bird sang in the clear sky. Mr. Sussman stood still and let the alpine wind cool his heated brow. Somebody came running down the mountain. It was Peter, with his dispatch in his hand. He ran as the crow flies, not following the path on which Mr. Sussman was standing. As soon as the runner was near enough, Mr. Sussman beckoned to him. Hesitatingly, And timidly Peter advanced sidewise, not in a straight line, and as he could not put one foot before the other properly, but must drag one behind him. "Well, my lad, this way," said Mr. Seaman encouragingly. "Just tell me if this path I shall come to the cottage where an old man lives with a child called Heidi, and where the people from Frankfurt are staying." A smothered cry of fear was the only answer, and Peter dashed away with such tremendous force that he went heels over head down the steep slope and rolled in involuntary somersaults farther and farther, just as the bath chair had done, only fortunately Peter did not come all to pieces like the chair. Meanwhile, the dispatch received terrible treatment and flew away, torn into bits. "A singularly bashful mountaineer," said Mr. Seaman to himself, for he supposed this conduct to have been caused by the unexpected appearance of a stranger before the simple Alpine boy. After he had watched Peter's powerful movement down the hillside for a little, he went on his way. Peter could not stop himself no matter how he struggled. He rolled on, and now and then, over and over. But this was not the worst for him at this moment. The worst was the knowledge that the policeman had arrived from Frankfurt, for Peter did not doubt that the stranger who had asked the way to the Elm uncle's hut was he. At last he tumbled into a bush about halfway down the slope toward Dorfli, and there he stuck fast. He lay still for a moment to collect himself and think what to do next. "This is first rate. Here comes another," said a voice close to Peter, "and who will get a shove tomorrow, I wonder, and come tumbling down like a half-made potato sack." It was the baker, who was joking in this wise. He had come up the hill a little way to refresh himself after his hot day's work, and had quietly watched Peter as he rolled, not unlike the bath chair, down the steep mountain side. The lad hastened to regain his feet. A new fear had seized him. Now the baker knew, too, that the chair had been shoved down. Without a single glance backward, Peter turned again up the mountain. If he could have his way, he would have liked to creep into his bed, for he felt safest there. But his goats were up above, and the uncle had strictly charged him to come back quickly, because they ought not to be left very long. He was afraid of the uncle, and had never yet ventured to disobey him. Peter groaned aloud and limped on. It must be. He must go up again. But he could not run. The anxiety and the manifold bruises that he had received distressed him too much. So he went, limping and groaning, all the way up the Alp. Mr. Seaman reached the first cottage soon after he had seen Peter, and when he thus knew that he was on the right path, he went on more courageously. At last he saw his goal before him. There stood the elm hut, and there the dark treetops of the old pines waved to and fro. Mr. Seaman went gaily along the ascent, picturing to himself his daughter's pleased surprise. He was quickly discovered and recognized by the party before the hut, where a surprise was ready for the father, of which he had no idea. As he came up the last steps of the hill, two figures came towards him. A larger girl with fair hair and a rosy face, supporting herself upon the smaller Heidi, out of whose dark eyes streamed glances of happiness. Mr. Seaman started. He stood still and stared at the approaching children. Suddenly, he stared. He started and then he stared at the approaching children. Suddenly, great tears rolled down his cheeks. What remembrances were rising in his heart! It was the image of Clara's mother that rose before him. So she looked, such golden locks, such rosy cheeks. Mr. Seaman did not know if he was awake or asleep. "Papa, do you know me again? Am I really so much altered?" And with the words, Clara was clasped in her father's arms. "Yes, you are altered. Is it possible? Is it reality?" The father drew a step or two backward to see if the picture would not vanish from before his eyes. Then again he folded her in his arms, and then held her off from him to gaze on her rosy cheeks and to see how firmly she held herself. By this time, the grandmamma had come up, for she could not wait another moment. She was so desirous of seeing her son's happy face. What do you say, my son? The surprise you have given us is good, but ours for you is far better, is it not? And she kissed her son affectionately. But now you must come up to the hut to make the acquaintance of the uncle who is your great benefactor. Certainly, and I ought to say a word to our little friend here, said Mr. Seisman as he shook Heidi's hand. How is it? Fresh and healthy once more on the Alp? But it is useless to ask. No alpine rose could look more blooming. This is a pleasure to me, child, a real pleasure. Heidi looked affectionately up into Mr. Seisman's face. How good he had always been to her, and that now, here on the Alps, such a great happiness should have befallen him made Heidi's heart beat rapidly for joy. Mr. Seisman carried her son off now to see the elm uncle, Mrs. Seisman. The two men stood holding each other's hands, and Mr. Seisman expressed his gratitude and astonishment at what seemed to him almost a miracle. The grandmamma turned away, for she had said all this a few moments before, and she wished to have another look at the old pines. Here, under the shade of the trees, where the broad branches left a free place, stood a great cluster of most wonderful dark blue gentians, as fresh as if they grew there naturally. She clasped her hands with pleasure and astonishment. How splendid! How lovely! What a sight! Come here, Heidi, my dear child. Did you arrange this for me? Is it perfectly wonderful? It is perfectly wonderful. The children were by her side in a moment. No, I did not do it, said Heidi, but I know who did. That is just the way it looks up in the pasture, and more beautiful yet, said Clara. But guess, Grandmamma, who brought you those flowers early in the morning from the pasture. And Clara smiled so merrily that the Grandmamma began to think the child had been up there herself before her arrival. But that indeed was a thing impossible. A slight noise was just then heard under the pines. It was made by Peter, who had just got back. When he saw from afar who was there with the elm uncle, he had made a wide circuit and was creeping secretly along under the trees. The grandmamma recognized him, and a new idea took possession of her. Peter must have brought these beautiful flowers down for her, and now was hiding himself for bashfulness. No, that could not be permitted. He must have a little recompense. Come, my lad, come here, quick, don't be afraid, said the grandmamma, and peered as she spoke through the trees at Peter. The lad stood still, stiff with fear. Escape was no longer possible to him. He had but one idea left. It is out! His hair stood on end, and pale and trembling, he crept out from behind the pines. Come, my boy, don't stay there, said grandmamma, meaning to encourage him. Now tell me, child, did you do it? As Peter did not raise his eyes, he did not see where the lady was pointing. He did not see that the uncle was standing not far off at the corner of the hut, piercing him with his clear gray eyes, and that the most dreadful of all people in the world, the policeman from Frankfurt, was standing by his side. Trembling and quivering in every limb, Peter gave forth a loud cry. It was yes! Now, said Grandmamma, what does all this fright mean? Because it is all broken to pieces and can never be mended, stammered the lad, and his knees shook so that he could no longer stand. The grandmamma went toward the corner of the hut. My dear uncle, said she compassionately, is that boy really cracked? No, not at the least, said the uncle reassuringly. The boy is only the wind that chased the bath chair. The boy is only the wind that chased the bath chair down the mountain, and now he is expecting his well-earned punishment. The grandmamma could hardly believe this, for she did not find Peter at all mischievous in appearance, and then he had no reason for destroying this very useful bath chair. The uncle, indeed, had only a suspicion to sustain his assertion, a suspicion that he had conceived directly after the deed. The scowling looks that Peter had cast at Clara from the very beginning, and all the signs of dislike he had manifested toward the visitors to the Alp, had not escaped the uncle. He had put this and that together, and was quite convinced that he understood the whole story, which he now confided to the grandmamma. When he had finished, the lady declared with great energy, "No, my dear uncle, no, no. The poor boy has been quite enough punished. One must be merciful. Here come strange people from Frankfurt and carry off his Heidi from him for whole weeks at a time, his only happiness, and truly a great happiness, and he sits up there alone day after day and looks on. No, no, one must be forgiving. Anger has overpowered him and driven him to a revenge which was rather a stupid one, I must acknowledge, but anger makes us all stupid." With this, the grandmamma went over to the poor fellow, who was still trembling and shaking violently. She sat down on the bench under the pines and said kindly, "Now come here, my lad. I have something to say to you. Stop shivering and shaking and listen. You must obey me. You pushed the bath chair down the mountain to break it in pieces. It was very wrong, and you knew it, and that you deserved to be punished you knew also, and so you tried very hard to prevent anybody from finding out what you had done. But now you see whoever has done a wrong deed and thinks that no one knows it deceives himself. The good God sees and hears everything, and as soon as he sees that anybody has done wrong and wishes to hide it, he wakens quickly, and that person, the little watchman that he has placed in everybody at his birth, and that is allowed to sleep until the person has done something wrong. That little watchman has a little sting in his hand, and with that he keeps pricking the wrongdoer until he has not one moment's peace. And then he worries the tormented person with his voice, for he calls out continually, 'Now they are coming to punish you. Now it is all found out.' So he is always anxious and frightened and has no comfort, not one bit. Have you not felt something like this, Peter, just now?" Peter nodded quite abashed, but that's ashamed, but consentingly, for the description was exact. "And yet in one way you were wrong in your calculation," said Grandmama further. "Just see how that wrong thing that you did has turned out to be the best, the very best, for the person toward whom you felt so unkindly. Because Clara had no chair in which she could be carried up the mountain to see the lovely flowers, she made great exertions to get to them, and so she learned to walk, and walks better and better every day. If she stays here at last, she will be able to go to the pasture whenever she chooses, much oftener than if she had to be rolled up in the chair. So you see, Peter, the good God can turn anything that is meant to be wicked into something good for the person who was to be hurt. And only the evildoer has the sorrow and the harm." Have you understood all that I have said, Peter? Well, then think on it, and every time you have inclination to do something wrong, think of the little watchman inside of you with his sting and disagreeable voice. Will you promise me that? "Yes, I will," replied Peter, still more depressed, for he did not know in the least what the end of this was to be. There was the policeman standing all this time beside the uncle. "Well, that is good. Now the thing is settled," returned the grandmamma, "but I mean to give you something in remembrance of the people from Frankfurt, something that you will like to have. So now tell me, have you ever wished for anything very much? What is it? What would you like best to have?" At this, Peter raised his head and stared at the grandmamma with big round eyes. He had been expecting something horrible to happen to him, and now he was to get something that he wanted very much. He scarcely knew what to think. Yes, I am in earnest," said the grandmamma. "You shall have something that you will like very much to remind you of us, and to show you that we do not remember what you have done to harm us. Do you understand, my boy?" At this, Peter's prospect began to clear up a little bit, and he understood that he had no punishment to fear, and that the good woman before whom he stood would save him from the power of the police. He felt a sense of relief, as if the mountain were lifted that had been weighing him down to the ground. He had also learned that it is wiser to acknowledge at once what one has done that is wrong than to wait until it is found out. So he said, And I lost the paper too. The grandmama had to ponder a little over this abrupt announcement, but she soon discovered the connection and said kindly, "Yes, yes, that is very good of you to tell it. Always confess anything you have done that is wrong, and then it can be repaired. Now tell me what you wish for." Peter realized now that he had to leave to wish for anything in the world, and he felt almost dizzy. That he had leave to wish for anything in the world, and he felt almost dizzy. The whole fair of Mayenfeld swam before his eyes with all the beautiful things that had stood for hours looking at and never even hoping to possess, for Peter's fortune was never so great but that everything there cost at least its double. There were the handsome red whistles which he could use for his goats so nicely. There were the tempting knives with round handles, toad stickers that were called, with which one could do a lively business in the hazel copses. I'm not sure. The boy stood deep in thought, trying to decide which of these two was the most desirable, and he found it impossible to choose. Presently, a luminous idea came to him, by which means he could wait until the next fair and have time to think it well over. "A penny," he said, quite decided. The grandmama laughed. "That is not extravagant. Come here." She drew out her purse and took it 2 florins, upon which she placed 4 pennies. "We will make a little calculation," she said. Here we have as many pennies as there are weeks in a year. You can take a penny every Sunday, and so have one every week all the year round. I'm wondering what 2 florins are, but that's what I was wondering, and how they end up with 52 pennies. But all right. "All the rest of my life?" asked the boy innocently. At this, the grandma began to laugh so immoderately that the uncle and Mr. Seaman broke off their conversation to hear what it was about. The grandmama kept on laughing. "You shall have it, my lad. There shall be a clause in my will to that effect. Do you hear, my son? A penny a week to the goat Peter, as long as he shall live." Mr. Seaman nodded approvingly and joined in the laugh. Peter gazed at the money in his hand to see if it were really true. Then he said, "Thank God," and he ran off in a most unusual fashion. But this time he kept his feet, for he was not driven by fear but joy, a joy such as Peter had never yet known. All fear and anxiety were gone, and he was to have a penny every week for the rest of his life. Later in the day, when the party had finished their merry dinner before the hut and sat there talking over all sorts of things, Clara took her father, whose face beamed more and more with joy each time he looked at her, by the hand and said, with a spiritliness that no one had ever observed in the delicate and languid child, "Oh, Papa, if you only could know what the grandfather has done for me, so much every day that it would be impossible to tell it all, but I shall never forget it in all my life, and I shall always be thinking how I can do something for him, or send him a present that will give him half the happiness that he has given me." "This is also my greatest wish, my dear child," said the father. "I am at this moment thinking of it, of how we can in some small measure repay what we owe his kindness." With the words, Mr. Seaman rose and went toward the uncle, who was sitting beside the grandmama and talking with his very animated, but who was talking very animatedly, but who rose as his guest came toward him. "My dear friend," said Mr. Seaman, taking the old man's hand very affectionately, "let me say a word to you. You can easily understand that for many years I have not known real happiness. What were all my money and my possessions worth to me when I glanced at my child and felt that I could never make her sound or well, no matter how much I might accumulate? Next to our good Heavenly Father, I feel that you have healed her for me and have given me, as well as the child, a new life. Now tell me how I can show you my gratitude. Recompense I cannot." That's what it says. "But what I possess I place at your disposal. Speak, my friend, is there anything I can do?" The elm uncle had listened in silence while surveying the happy parent with a benevolent smile. Mr. Seisman will well believe that I that I have my share in the pleasure of this cure which has been worked on my beloved elm. But my trouble is more than repaid, said he in his decided manner. I thank Mr. Seisman for his kind offer, but I need nothing whatever. As long as I may live, I have enough for myself and for my grandchild. I have one wish, however, and could that be fulfilled, I should for this life feel no further concern. Name it, my dear friend, begged Mr. Seisman. I am old, continued the uncle, and cannot live very much longer. When I go, I cannot leave the child anything, and she has no other relatives, no one person who would take charge of her and care for her. If Mr. Seisman will give me the assurance that Heidi need never go out into the world to seek her bread among strangers, he will have richly repaid me for what I have done for his daughter. But, my dear friend, said Mr. Seisman, there can never be any question of that at all. The child belongs to us. Ask my mother, ask my daughter, if they would ever dream of allowing Heidi to go to anybody else as long as they were living. But if it would be of the least comfort to you, here is my hand upon it. I promise you that this child shall never in her life go out to earn her bread among strangers. I will provide against that now and after my death. I will see to that this child of yours is not made to live among strangers, no matter how favorable the circumstances might be. We have experienced that, but she has made friends for herself. I know such a one. He is in Frankfurt, closing up his affairs to be able to go where he will and give himself some rest. That is my friend Dr. Klassen, who means to return here in the autumn and to establish himself taking counsel with you in this neighborhood, for he has never felt so well elsewhere, he says. So you see the child Heidi will have henceforth two protectors near her. May you both live long and happily together. God grant this may be so, said the grandmamma, and shook the uncle's hand for a long time with great cordiality. Then, putting her arm around Heidi's neck, for the child stood near her, she said very tenderly, and you, my dear child, you must also ask for something. Tell me now, have you no wish that you would gladly have fulfilled? Yes, indeed I have, answered Heidi, and looked at the grandmamma with much satisfaction. Well, tell me at once, my child. I should like to have my bed from Frankfurt with the high pillows and the thick coverlet, because the blind grandmother has to lie with her head down and can scarcely breathe, and then she will be warm enough under the coverlet and not have to wear the shawl in bed because she is so cold. Heidi had said this without stopping to breathe. She was in such haste to express this darling wish of hers. Oh, my dear Heidi, what are you saying? Cried the grandmamma, with much moved. It is a good thing that you reminded me of this, for in great happiness it is so easy to forget one's duties. When God sends us everything that is good, we ought to think of those who are deprived of so much. We will telegraph to Frankfurt at once. This very day, Rottenmeier shall pack the bed, and it will get here in 2 days. God willing, the grandmother shall sleep well in it. Heidi danced round and round the grandmamma as the easiest way to express her delight. But suddenly she stood still and said, now I must go down to tell the grandmother all about it. She will be anxious because I have not been to see her for so long. No, no, Heidi, what are you thinking of? Said the grandfather reprovingly. When one has visitors, it is not proper to run away and leave them. But the grandmamma supported Heidi. The child is right, my dear uncle, she said. The poor grandmother has for a long time been deprived of enough on our account. We will all go together to see her, and I will take my horse from her cottage. Then we will go down to Dorfli and will telegraph at once to Frankfurt. What do you think of it, my son? But Mr. Seisman had not yet had time to talk over his trip. He therefore begged his mother to be quiet a little a little while and not to start off so hastily, as he wished to say a few more words to the uncle. Mr. Seisman had proposed to travel a little with his mother through Switzerland and to see if Clara were strong enough to make a short distance with them. Now it was all so different. He could have the most delightfully interesting trip with his daughter, and he would make use of these beautiful late summer days for that purpose. He therefore proposed to pass the night in Dorfli, and the next day to take Clara away from the elm in order to journey with her to her grandmama and Ratsbad, and from there farther. The uncle took his foster daughter on his arm and followed with firm steps the grandmama and Heidi. Last of all came Mr. Seisman, and in this manner they went down the mountain. Heidi went dancing and jumping along by the grandmama's side, and the latter wished to know all about the poor blind woman, how she lived, and how everything went on in her house, especially in winter. The grandmama listened with the liveliest interest to Heidi's account until they reached the hut. Bridget was then busy hanging Peter's second shirt in the sun to dry, so that when he had worn the other long enough, he could change. She caught sight of the company and ran into the cottage. "Now they are all going away, mother," she said. "There is a whole procession of them, and the uncle is carrying the sick child." "Oh, must it really be?" sighed the grandmother. "Are they going to take Heidi with them? Do you see that? Oh, how could I wish I could take her hand once more. If I could only hear her speak again." At this moment the door flew open and Heidi came leaping in, up to the corner where the old woman sat, and hugged her tightly. "Grandmother, grandmother, my bed is coming from Frankfurt, and all the 3 pillows and the thick coverlet. They will be here in 2 days. The grandmama says so." Heidi was not able to bring out her words fast enough in her impatience to see the great delight of the grandmother, who smiled but looked rather sad. "Oh, what a good woman she is. I ought to be glad that she is taking you with her, Heidi, but I shall not live long after it." "What? What? Who told you the good grandmother such a thing as that?" It was the friendly voice of Mrs. Seisman, and her hand grasped that of the blind woman, which she pressed warmly. "No, no, there is no talk of any such thing. Heidi is going to stay with the grandmother and always make her happy. We wish to see the child again, but we came to her. We shall come up the elm every year, for we have good reason to thank God for the goodness he has shown to us up here, where he has performed a miracle on our dear child." With this, the light of true happiness came over the face of the grandmother, and with speechless joy she pressed the hand of the kind Mrs. Seisman, while 2 big tears rolled slowly down her face. Heidi recognized the look of happiness, however, and was contented. There were hot tears shed the next morning when it was time for Clara to take leave. The girl was very loath to part from her friends and from the beautiful elm where she had felt well, as she had never felt before. But Heidi comforted her, saying, "It will be summer again before we think of it, and then you will come again, and it will be more beautiful than ever. Then we can begin at once to walk about and go up every day with the goats to the pasture and see the flowers, and everything will be delightful from the beginning." Clara wiped the tears from her eyes, for Heidi's words had comforted her a little. "Give my goodbye to Peter," she said, "and to all the goats. I wish I could give Schwanli something. She has helped me so much in making me well." "You can do that easily enough," said Heidi. "Send her a little salt. You know how she likes to lick it from grandfather's hand in the evening." This counsel pleased Clara. "Oh, I will send 100 pounds from Frankfurt," she cried, "as a remembrance of me." Mr. Seisman here beckoned to the children, for he must be going. Mrs. Seisman's white horse had been sent up for Clara. She could ride down now. She no longer needed a litter. Heidi stationed herself on the most prominent point of the slope and waved her hand to Clara until there was no longer a sign of horse or rider to be seen. The bed from Frankfurt has arrived, and the grandmother sleeps so soundly every night that she will certainly get new strength from it. The good grandmama has also not forgotten the hard winter on the Alp. She has sent a big package to the goat Peter's cottage, and it were all sort and in and in it were all sorts of warm things so that the grandmother could wrap herself up very snugly and not shiver from the cold in her corner. In Dorfley, a great building is going up. By the advice of the uncle, the doctor has purchased the old building that he and Heidi lived in, which was formerly a fine house, as fine a house as one might see from the room where the stove with the beautiful tiles stood. This part of the doctor is to have arranged from this part the doctor is to have arranged for his lodging. The other part will be in condition for the uncle and Heidi, for the doctor recognizes in his old friend an independent man who must have his own dwelling place. Quite at the back, Schwanlee and Barley will have comfortable winter lodgings. My dear friend, said the doctor recently to his companion as they stood together on the walls, you must look at the thing from my point of view. I share all your pleasure in the child as if I were her next nearest relative. I must also share all duties. In this way, I shall have a kind of right to our Heidi and can hope that she will care for me in my old age and stay with me and nurse me. That is my dearest wish. She shall be recognized as my heiress. And when we leave her behind, you and I, we need not be anxious about her comfort. In the meantime, Heidi and Peter sat together at the grandmother's side. The former had so much to tell the latter, so much to hear, that they pressed closer and closer against the happy blind woman, who listened intently to the little girl's account of the exciting events of the past summer, when Heidi's visitors prevented her from going to the cottage. And of the three who sat thus together, each looked happier than the other because of being all once more together and because of all the delightful things that had taken place. At last the grandmother said, Heidi, read me a hymn of praise. It seems to me that I ought to do nothing but praise and glorify our Lord God for all that he has in his mercy granted us, his poor children. That's it. I know I've heard this story. I know I've seen the movie. I think I've heard the story before too. I don't know who read it to me though. I don't know who would have read it to me. That is the end of our book. We'll have to think of another book. I was going to have it be The Gilded Age, but that's 500 pages and I'm listening to it now on YouTube. I just started. And I loved the beginning of it already. And I loved the preface of it already. So read the preface or listen to the preface. I wasn't going to read it. And then I had to listen to it because I wanted to listen to it. All right. So we're done with day 131 in the classroom. Thanks for joining me. We're also done with our book, Heidi, on day 131. So that took us what? 22 days? Is that what we're on? Day 23? Is that what we're on? It's reconnecting. There we go. We're reconnecting. Adios. Thanks a lot for joining me.